I'll start with this. We're going to look at T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent today. We last class looked at Harold Bloom and his the Western Canon, which in some ways purports to defend tradition, I guess, given the name of the title, etc. But I said to you that it was one of the more idiosyncratic defenses of tradition that one might ever find, because his whole rationale for it is that for the sake of aesthetics, so beauty for beauty's sake, which is more or less quoting Oscar Wilde, and is nothing like a traditional defense of literature. So it's an odd position to be in, and it really speaks to the poverty of the age that and how much the traditional humanities had declined by the time he wrote it, that the traditional defense comes from someone who is nothing like a traditionalist. He's a romantic scholar who has very idiosyncratic views. But at least I will give him this, and I think that there's something to it. At least he defends beauty and thinks that there is such a thing as beauty and wants to uphold it, and he is opposed to the cultural studies approaches which more or less evacuate literature of everything, or in fact rather effectively accept the position of Terry Eagleton that there is no such thing as literature. So for Bloom, at least there is such a thing as literature, and he wants to defend it and wants to defend a wide variety of works of literature, and he calls that the Western Canon. Eliot, T.S. Eliot, on the other hand, whom I wanted to present after Bloom, even though he writes long before Bloom, gives a far better defense of tradition, and one that I think is probably the most important work of the 20th century in literary criticism. Certainly, I would say it is vastly influential in a way that Bloom has not really been, to be honest. Bloom was an important literary critic of his day, but the Western Canon really had no observable effect on his contemporaries. So it's a man towards the end of his academic career, presenting almost an elegy. He's talking about something that's gone. And there's no agenda for how to preserve it, etc. Whereas this man today, T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot, let me give you a little biographical information. So he's born in 1888, and he dies the year after C.S. Lewis does, 1965. They were contemporaries. There's significant overlap there, but they were not friends. And I find those things odd in some ways, and I don't have enough information to explain that. I know that Lewis didn't like his poetry, that is Eliot's poetry, but I tend not to be a huge fan of Eliot's poetry either, at least his early poetry. But his later poetry, I most certainly am. So the 4 quartets by Eliot are great, terrific stuff. And as are some other poems there, but really good. And there's no doubt he's a major poet, and so his collected poems here are to be recommended, but particularly the 4 quartets. Excellent stuff. So one of the great poets of the 20th century, connected with the modernist movement. Also, for the purposes of this course, in terms of literary criticism, he is important for the works of another group of critics that we're not going to delve into explicitly at all, just simply because of time. And it's sort of odd, and I still am questioning myself on why I did this, but the new critics of the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, T.S. Eliot is often associated with what they are doing there. And maybe I'll say something more about that when we come to the book At War with the Word, because he's really defending the new critics and their vantage point, traditional view. But let me say more about Eliot, but he's often lumped in with the new critics, even though, and he is an American. So he was born in St. Louis, Missouri. educated at Harvard and at Oxford. But unlike many people, and it's an odd thing in a way, he moves to the United Kingdom and naturalizes, becomes a citizen there, becomes an Anglican, etc., converts to the Christian faith while he's there, becomes a royalist even. So all of these things, it's the reversal of the Harry and Meghan thing that's going on as we speak. He is an American moving to the United Kingdom, and he's becoming the representative of an Englishness. And I don't know if that has anything to do with C.S. Lewis as well, who's from Northern Ireland, but if you actually hear him speak, you would think you were hearing an Englishman. I'm going to try and find some lectures for you for that C.S. Lewis class, and so you can hear him. He sounds as posh in English as you can get. It doesn't. There's not a hint of Northern Irish in his accent, at least not that I can detect. So maybe he resents that. You don't get us English. I know he disagreed with some of his criticisms of poets like Shelley, for instance. Eliot critiques him, Lewis defends him. I'm with Eliot and not with Lewis on this. But in any event, educated at Harvard and Oxford, studies at least briefly in France and in Germany for that matter. But in 1914, so right at the outset of the First World War, he settles in England and he stays there. And is naturalized as a citizen 1927, so 13 years later. And the first major poem he writes is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That's 1915, so right in the middle of the First World War. Not my favorite poem. The Wasteland, on the other hand, which he writes, makes him the spokesman for his generation. And it's published in 1922. So it's often taken as a commentary on Western culture, the wasteland, and becomes the friend and protege of Ezra Pound. So there's lots of common ground there with many influential literary figures in the period. Founds his own journal called The Criterion, which exists to this very day, and works in the banking industry, interestingly. So he's a financier and so forth. Eventually joins a publishing firm called Faber and Faber, a famous British publishing firm, and eventually becomes the director thereof. And when he describes himself a little later on in the preface to a volume for Lancelot Andrews, who's a royalist of the 17th century, here's how he describes himself. His beliefs are classical in literature, royalist in politics, Anglo-Catholic in religion. And I say the most important work that he writes for my money is the Four Quartets, 1944, which is, by that point, he's now Anglo-Catholic, so he's more explicitly Christian than he began when he was writing his poets. He got the Nobel Prize for literature as well later on in his life. So he's a famous, celebrated poet. We're looking at him as a critic. And he's substantive as a critic, and his notes towards the definition of culture, 1948, I would recommend. It's very good. So he moves, and in some ways this is interesting because this is my dilemma, or what happens invariably on a course of literary criticism as we enter into the 20th century. Is it shifts almost from being only about defending and talking about literature to talking more broadly about culture, because they seem to be implicated. It's not just about literature. There's a general assault on culture, which I think is implicit also in what Terry Eagleton said when there is no such thing as literature. Really what he means is there's no such thing as culture. As in something that needs to be held on to, something out of which we live and breathe and move and understand ourselves. Remember, he's a Marxist and thinks that culture is a provisional thing. It's here today, but tomorrow it can be better. He's revolutionary in his politics, in other words. He stands against everything that Eliot stands for, in that sense, right? Classical in literature, royalist in politics, Anglo-Catholic in religion. So very elitist in certain respects. So when he writes this, and I do think that this work that we're looking at, by the way, so we're going to come to this very briefly when we go back to Eagleton's work on the rise of English. English literature as a humanities subject only emerges after the First World War. So not before that. It's studied, and Eagleton will explain about this, it's studied in women's colleges in the 19th century. It's not a serious subject. It's not something that academics busy themselves with. It's in their language, it's in their culture, it's something that you read for pleasure, but it's not really considered a subject that's worthy of academic pursuit. After the First World War, that changes. So while he is writing this essay and talking about these things, it has certain problems. And one of them is that it really lacks intellectual discipline. There are no disciplinary boundaries for English. And there is also no concept of literary tradition within English. That is going to be forged by the early authors and scholars like Tolkien and Lewis. They are amongst them. And there's Lewis, or rather Eliot is engaging with those things here in this essay. Now, as I say, I think this is one of his earliest essays, but one of his most important ones. And without further ado, I would like to actually look at that. But he's specifically talking about tradition and wanting to first define what it is and then defend what it is. And say that it's a necessary thing and that it's also essential to his understanding of what literature is, for that matter. And if you want to broaden it out more fully, what culture is and how does it fit with that. So this course that I'm teaching now, I'm, as you know, because at least many of you are in the other course, I'm doing C.S. Lewis. They really are overlapping for me. He's talking about similar sorts of things, doing similar sorts of things. So when Lewis observes that come the 19th century, the mid-19th century, when the abolition of man begins, when the human nature becomes a subject of scientific experimentation and scientific study, that's the very time when tradition drops out, becomes insignificant. A cultural orphanage ensues. It's a direct consequence of the adaptation of the human sciences or the social sciences. Because it's a different approach. We don't cultivate human beings by passing on a tradition and going through the hard work of reading the texts and wrestling with authors and seeking to understand what they're saying and looking at sophistication and subtlety and wit and irony and so forth. We don't do any of those things. Rather, we adopt a new scientific approach to human nature, which there's no precedent for it. And you can't do both at the same time because they're actually, one is opposed to the other. And we saw that, I mentioned that in one of the psychologists, eminent psychologists of the early or the later 20th century, explicitly speaks about the literatures of freedom and dignity, B.F. Skinner. And he says that Lewis is the chief exponent, a defender of this. He could have said actually T.S. Eliot, but it does say something about how much he esteems Lewis that he connects it with Lewis. But he could have said Eliot because both of them will do so. And so then the question I'm going to raise, and I already know the answer to it, why not Eliot? Because Eliot's the Nobel Prize winner. right? So he's acknowledged for his greatness. Lewis is never acknowledged in that way in the 20th century by his contemporaries. None of his literary works achieve anything like the popularity, or at least the academic and the elite's approval like Eliot does. In fact, Lewis and Tolkien are both looked down upon as intellectuals within the academic community to this very day. Whereas Eliot, not so. And why is that so? And it's connected with this essay. And I'll just give it away. It's because he defines literature and tradition in his day and explicitly makes it an arcane or elite subject. So it's intentionally difficult, elusive, if not even obscure. So its intended audience is small. It's not trying to be a broad-reaching, all human nature defending discipline. It's for a certain group of very specialized readers who will understand what the poet is writing about. So they've almost conceded the abolition of man. In fact, he has conceded it. And so in our day, there's a writer in the United States, Catholic writer by the name of Rod Dreher, who writes a book called The Benedict Movement, which you might have read or might not have read, but you probably have heard of. And he is arguing that in our day, Christians need to, in order to preserve Christianity in the midst of the cultural onslaught, need to do something like the early monks did when the Roman Empire fell, which is to preserve their culture, retreat within monasteries, so to speak, pass on the tradition amongst themselves while the world goes to hell in a handbasket, more or less, around them. They can't stop it. There's no common cultural ground to do so. So to retreat. And Eliot, to me, in his defense of tradition and the individual talent, I agree with the defense, but the poetics is explicitly, in terms of his poetry, it is hard to read, difficult to understand, and it requires a high degree of intellectual achievement in order to appreciate it. So it's for the 1%, to use a different terrible metaphor. Whereas Lewis and Tolkien, who have the learning that he is saying you need, nonetheless, they don't go for that. They actually appeal to the common man. Right? So they have a similar appreciation for tradition. They have a similar degree of learning. So Eliot's a very bright and learned man. He does read multiple languages. He explicitly quotes them in his poetry. But he also writes only for that elite, and he's making there's no common appeal. So he gets a Nobel Prize out of it. But nobody reads him outside of people in universities, many of whom will enormously appreciate him. And some think that he's the best poet going, and perhaps he is, but he has no common appeal. And poetry, historically, traditionally, has mass appeal. That's part of what poetry does. Poetry is even. So now I'm taking the broad view from the beginning when we looked at Plato and Aristotle, and then comparing this to the 20th century defenders of tradition. And tradition now we're looking at two different defenders. Harold Bloom on the one hand, who's just a really oddball aesthete, defending it as an aesthetic, works of beauty. And then Eliot, who sees it as more than that. No, it's much richer and deeper than that. But at the same time, it's the preserve for a clerisy of sorts. You know? A few monkish figures, not culturally transformative. So in both cases, it's not culturally transformative. One, because he restricts it to beauty only. The other, because he makes it so explicitly difficult to understand that he limits his audience. And if you read Narnia and you read The Lord of the Rings, everyone feels the impact. And to me, that's the better poet. not that Eliot isn't a better poet in certain respects he is, but the intentional obscurantism, I think, is not helpful. But that's just my comment on it. Let's read what he has to say here, because I do think it's enormously helpful, and I agree with so much of what he writes in the essay. The poetry, aside from the four quartets, I personally am not so fond of and have my issues with. But the critique here is terrific stuff for the most part. So I'll just read some extracts from Tradition and the Individual Talent, and then note the sophistication of his argument as well, because it is quite sophisticated. So in English writing, he writes, "We seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that poetry of so-and-so is traditional, or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative, with the implication, as to the work approved, of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. Certainly the word," now he's still talking about tradition, "is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race, has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind. And it is even more obvious." Now note how he juxtaposes those. The one is a productive, creative thing, and the other is a critical one, which is almost the opposite. It takes things apart. It analyzes it, dissects it. So one is the poetic mindset, and the other is the scientific or the philosophical mindset even. And both of them are necessary. And he says it is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and the limitations of its critical habits than those of its critical genius. We know, or think we know, from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French. We only conclude, we are such unconscious people, we, speaking of himself as an Englishman, that the French are, quote, more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact, as if the French were less spontaneous. So the more critical is normally, it's a note of praise. The British are happy that they don't think too critically about things. He's correct. It exists to this day. As if they were a little less spontaneous, perhaps they are. But we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. Now, by the way, this word criticism, I've used theory repeatedly. Criticism comes actually from the Greek word krinos, which is a touchstone. You know what a touchstone is? It establishes whether something is true gold or false gold. It's a touchstone, a krinos, that's the stone. And a critic is somebody who is able to discern gold from fool's gold or some other base metal. So that's what criticism is. It involves discrimination, which is a bad word in our day. But effectively, I think it's a necessary thing to criticism. It assumes the legitimacy of logic and the laws of logic. That they hold and they are valid. It assumes all of those things. That's what's necessary in order to be critical. And we've used this word theory on the other hand, so this is criticism. Literary criticism has an aspect that assumes logic and so forth, whereas theory is also from Greek, from a verb theoreo, which is I behold, I look upon, I look. But in theory, as it emerges in Terry Eagleton and so forth, it is no longer looking at everything, it's overlooking everything. Because effectively there's nothing there. I mean, there's no such thing as literature, remember. Now, this is problematic in the sense because the word literary theory, as it arises in the 20th century and is used by Eagleton and company, it uses a good word and starts to associate it with something that it never used to be associated with. So Plato uses the word theory to describe what the philosopher does when he looks at the forms. And when he does, he's not imagining things that aren't there. He says that there is a good and a true and a beautiful and a just. And the philosopher beholds such things. He looks at them. The white horse of the chariot sees them quite clearly and rides up that way. That's what theory does in Plato's understanding. Whereas in contemporary literary theory, theory looks and gazes and sees no prejudices. It overlooks all such things, particularly things like the forms of goodness and justice and beauty. Right? So it's ironically the opposite of Plato's theory. It's also the opposite of what Samuel Taylor Coleridge uses the term for. So, because he's the first one that comes up with the terms theory and practical criticism. So there's theory, which is the literary criticism more or less, and then there's practical criticism, which is what we discussed on that course, which is the study of the guts, the machinery of poetry. So I just need to say that because terms are often used by different writers in different generations. Sometimes they slightly differ and sometimes they altogether differ. In this case, the notion of theory of the theorists of our day is nothing like that which was intended historically, which is probably not surprising, but nonetheless worth mentioning here. So he says that criticism is as inevitable as breathing. Yes, because it's part of the human condition, and it's part of thinking, and it's part of judging. And judgment is necessary in order to live justly and to make evaluations of beauty and goodness and truth. Prejudice is necessary. So Eagleton, once again, agrees with Immanuel Kant, although he applies it far more broadly than Kant would ever have agreed that prejudice is something we ought to avoid. So prejudice is an evil because it's a discernment. It's a prior judgment that we use in order to come and understand the world. Kant, like all the Enlightenment, thinks that prejudice is ipso facto evil because it's a prejudice. We need to move away from that. We need to get beyond that, look to a future and not be dependent on the past. In fact, in his little treatise, What is Enlightenment, he talks precisely about being emancipated from the self-imposed non-age, that is your immaturity, and being committed to those of the past who are going to teach you. Take charge of your own life. Dare to know, he says. Don't listen to what the authorities say. Don't follow tradition. Ignore the prejudices of the foregoing writers. So it's a revolutionary manifesto in some ways, Immanuel Kant's What is Tradition? Or What is Enlightenment? And I think that Eagleton is following this when he's talking about theory. The thing that we are most going to seek to do, though, in theory now, is to eradicate the whole literary tradition. And the best way to do that is to say there is no such thing as literature. It's adopting a tabula rasa culturally and then applying it and see what's happening, see what they can affect thereby. It's what Lewis called the abolition of man. So back to this, because For Eliot, this is absurd. Criticism is as inevitable as breathing, which I think he's right, even in spite of what Eagleton does. Criticism is as inevitable as breathing because we always judge. In fact, this is what sorry, I'm going all over the place. This is what Hans-Georg Gadamer said in response to Kant. He says that Immanuel Kant had a prejudice against prejudice, which I just think is a hilarious observation. One of the pupils of Martin Heidegger, his name's Gadamer. Kant and the Enlightenment had a prejudice against prejudice. So in other words, their attempt to get beyond prejudice or to eradicate it for the sake of progress is doomed to fail because they had a prejudice. And now the only thing about their prejudice is that it was the most prejudicial of all prejudices. And I would say it still lies behind the contemporary appeal for inclusion and tolerance. It's the most intolerant of all forms of tolerance, of intolerance rather. It won't tolerate anything other than itself, which seems to me like the definition of intolerance. I don't want to get into politics too much, but it invariably has a political consequence, which is the point I'm making about literary criticism and its defenders in the 20th century and even in the 21st. They don't seem to recognize or be willing to acknowledge that this is more than a literary phenomenon. It becomes a broad cultural phenomenon and it even becomes a political one. And that's intentional because, again, Eagleton and company are effectively Marxists. And they adopt the Marxist view of culture, and Marx's view of culture is that culture is a bourgeois activity. Whereas the real business of life is material accumulation of goods. And injustice is the fact that some have more material wealth than others, and we'll rectify that. But culture, that's just a distraction. So back to Eliot's essay. That's quite the digression. He says, we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. What is in these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the man. So what is not like anyone else, that's what the individual is. We dwell with satisfaction on the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. So we look at Milton as a 17th century writer and we distinguish him from Donne or Herbert or one of the other authors. And what makes Milton is, when we reduce everything that's common, that's what we have left. Well, that's what makes Milton Milton. Is that a good definition? This is what he's questioning. We dwell with satisfaction on the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the full period of full maturity. So in other words, Milton, to give my example again, is the most Milton when he most channels Virgil and Homer and Scripture. When he is most speaking of the tradition implicitly, when there's a richness and a depth to it, that's when he is most himself. It's not when he's most in contradistinction to them when he's being novel. So he's going after the cult of novelty of our day, of originality. And another writer that you might want to read, he's not on the course as a required reading, is T.E. Hume. He has an essay called Romanticism and Classicism. And of course, he is with the classicists and going against the romantic, expressive, original hypothesis for art, which Eagleton also dismisses, but not for the same reason. He debunks it quite easily and out of hand, but not because he wants to uphold tradition, on the contrary. Whereas Hume and Eliot are going to want to uphold the tradition and say what is best about Milton is precisely what he has most in common with all the others that went before him. That's the best part of Milton, not the thing that's unique and most distinctive where we can hear Milton's voice, but or Shakespeare. When we read Shakespeare and think of his language and his concepts and his allusions, we also hear other writers in dialogue with him. That's what he's talking about. There's a whole crowd of witnesses, as it talks about in Hebrews, of those who walk by faith, a whole crowd of witnesses there of other authors that are cheering him on. So in Virgil's, or rather Dante's Divine Comedy, when he is on his way down through the Inferno to begin with, he starts and he meets other epic poets and they greet him and welcome him amongst their company. And he puts them in limbo. He doesn't put them in, he can't bear to put them in the Inferno. They're in this anti-portal called limbo. And they greet him as one of their own because he genuinely reveres them, so much so that Virgil accompanies him on his journey, leads him, in fact. Now that's certainly doing more than tipping your cap, saying, I am not who I am without you. Now, this is what he's talking about in tradition and the individual talent. Now, how it works out in his own writing is, again, it's so deliberately, self-consciously allusive in his writing that it becomes really hard to read. He's so aware of the tradition that he never escapes it. As I say, in his most mature, the 4 quartets, I think he starts to do it. So maybe he should be judged by that. By the way, I said to somebody in the hallway the other day, there are writers that I don't like and I don't teach them. And the reason I don't teach them is because I don't think I'd be fair to them if I taught them. That's why I don't teach them, because I don't think I'd give them a fair shake in my class, and that's not what I'm here to do. I want to give people their best representation. So I'm not saying that they can't be defended well. I'm saying I can't defend them well. So I'm not going to. Whereas somebody else might be able to, one of my colleagues, somebody else somewhere, and you should listen to what they have to say and take it for what it is. I think that's Lewis's position more or less as well. That's why he doesn't want a canon. So it's like, well, I like these writers, and so I'm going to defend that, and I'm going to present that, but I'm not going to talk about this because I don't like that particularly well. I don't appreciate it. I don't have a taste for it, so I'm not going to pretend to instruct you in it. I'm going to let you decide, and maybe go to somebody else who can defend them well, because I'm not the one. But so that's really interesting already. So when he's talking about the individual is most himself when he's most working within the tradition. That's when he's most himself, not when he's not as we commonly see it, when he is most unique and different from them. Yet, I'm going to read on. If the only form of tradition, of handing down, consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should positively be discouraged. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. mere repetition, blind repetition without any feeling for it or sense of why it's worth preserving. We don't just do things because our parents did them. We do it because we know it was right. We have to own it for ourselves. This is part of leaving your parents' house and coming to university. You might be a Christian when you come here. You start to own it when you are working it through for yourself. I'm not disputing who you were before you came here. You can be a Christian coming here, but it takes on a newer and deeper significance when you are defending it, not because it's the way you were brought up, it's because that's who I am. And that's what you get when you're no longer just simply imitating, but you're actually working it out. And your context is different from that of your parents, right? Because it's a very different world. So it needs to be worked out, and it needs to have a fresh voice. So that's what he's talking about, tradition. So it's a living thing. It's not a dead thing. Let the dead bury the dead. He says, we have seen many such simple currents lost in the sand. Novelty is better than repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited. And if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. Now that's what the liberal arts would have traditionally done. It's hard work becoming cultured. You got to read a lot of books. And not only do you have to read them, as in you get through it. I've read this many books. I've wrestled with it. I have spent hours trying to understand what the poet's saying here. And when I didn't get it, which I didn't, because most of the time I've understood some of what he's conveying, I can go back and read it, and I get more the second time and the third time. Those are the good texts, by the way. Same with scripture. There are depths that are so deep there that I never exhaust them, however many times I come back to it. But it takes time. It's great labor. It involves, Eliot says, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. So he doesn't dispute, as Bloom said last time, all bad poetry is sincere. In fact, he believes exactly the same thing. Young people are very sincere. They're passionate. They feel strongly about what they believe to be true. And they might be right about it, but that doesn't mean their expression is good or is going to last. It flames out very quickly. And a good poet will have something that we will want to preserve. And he says, and the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. There you go. Brilliant. Traditional not in the sense of old, but of the ongoing relevance of the old in the modern, in the contemporary. And not only of something that is old, but of something that speaks and speaks in every generation. So the literature is of freedom and dignity once again. There's a dignity to the figures that we meet in the Iliad. To Achilles and Odysseus. To Priam, when he goes to Achilles and asks for his son's body, Hector, which is being desecrated, he's dragged around the camp. Is so disgraceful that the gods themselves are repelled by Achilles' act, and so are all of his fellow Greeks. They can't believe what he's doing to Hector's body. And Priam comes out in the middle of the night. He's still the king of Troy, and Troy has not yet fallen. He comes out under cover of darkness to meet Achilles in his tent, and now he is offering up his life at that point. Because if he's caught, he's dead, and if he's dead, the war is over. And he goes to retrieve his son's body, and he's not come there. They haven't agreed that he's safe. He's come there under the cover of darkness and he can slit his throat and it's over. He receives him and he comes up and he kneels down and he kisses Achilles' hand. And this is the hand that slew my son. And Achilles says, this is a man with a heart of iron. And he gives him up. In the greatness of that man who would do such a thing because of the honor he held for his son was greater than the city that he was defending, right? So it's those moments of pathos don't go away. Now that is what he's talking about. We can feel that as real as if it happened in front of us. That's what, so the timeless and the temporal together, that's what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his own contemporaneity. Because he's aware of the moment and the fleetingness of experience and of life. And yet it's picked up in those fleeting moments of the past that are captured in great literature, and makes him aware that his own age is not the top of the pinnacle of human nature, knowing better than everyone else who lived before them, just because they've got a smartphone or something like that, right? That's me, not Eliot, in case it wasn't obvious. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. I teach this in my classes, as you know. That's exactly why we study different poets from different ages and look at the genres in which they've all collaborated in. They're explicitly courting our comparison and wanting us to see, like Milton wants to assert the truth of Christianity in Paradise Lost. There's no doubt about it. But he also wants to assert that he's an epic poet, and he wants to, in order to do that, he is acknowledging the greatness of those before him, explicitly. And that's not because he's in any ways a pagan. He's not conceding anything other than the great humanity of those that wrote in such a way. And thereby he's acknowledging the importance of culture. Because otherwise he'd be undermining his own epic. Culture matters. And he thinks so. So he says, the necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. Now, how about that as a consideration? When Milton writes an epic, he changes the epic. He isn't only... The whole epic gets redefined, because we not only read Milton's epic in the light of Homer's, we now start to read Homer's in the light of Milton's. And when Wordsworth comes along and writes his epic, the Prelude, we read Wordsworth as a commentary on Milton and as a commentary on Virgil and Dante and Homer and so forth. And it changes. Now, Wordsworth claims, just as Milton does, that his epic is superior to those that went before him. So we think that there is a progress being made of sorts, but progress in the sense that doesn't leave the tradition behind. It's part of who we are. It's part of our identity. So the existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so lightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work towards the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. Now compare this to the class I'm teaching on the discarded image. The discarded image refers to something that we no longer hold to, the medieval Renaissance image, picture. But it's not something that immediately happens. As I say, the discarded image doesn't get jettisoned after the Renaissance. It gets jettisoned in the late 19th century. It is slowly being changed, transformed up until that point. But the Romantics still assume it. They're writing against it. They're saying we're superior to it, but they've read all the authors that they are saying that they are progressing on from. And they refer to them explicitly. It's only discarded now, when man has been abolished. That's when it's the discarded image, but it's not an immediate. So as soon as the Renaissance is over, we can forget everything that he writes in there. Because when you read Milton, you realize actually that's Milton's image as well. You come to the 18th century, it's the 18th century, even in the midst of the Enlightenment. It assumes the same very sorts of things. These are foundational. That's the tradition. Now, as I say, Eliot, his response to this is he's more or less, by being deliberately elusive and so forth, he's going to reduce the poet and his task and his audience to a small group. Is he right in so reducing it? Let's say he is. For himself, he was. Lewis and Tolkien didn't want to go that way. Maybe that's why they did not. Like, think about this. Brilliant Christian writers, all. And yet not really working together there. Like, why wasn't Eliot brought into the Inklings? Was around the same time. He lived the same time. He was in the same place. There's a different view of Christianity and culture, I think, going on there. One is more battening down the hatches to some degree, and let's preserve it, and let's write for an elite. And then there's the academics, allegedly in the ivory tower, who are actually writing for everybody. That's how I perceive it, and I don't mean to be unfair to Eliot or unfair to Lewis and Tolkien. It seems to me that's the ground between them. In a peculiar sense, going back to Eliot's essay, he, that is the poet, will be aware that also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. Of the past, not the present. I say judged, not amputated by them, not judged to be as good as or worse or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison, in which two things are measured by each other. To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all. It would not be new, and would therefore not be a work of art. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting in is a test of its value. A test, it is true, which can only be slowly and cautiously applied. For we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. We say it appears to conform, and it is perhaps, and is perhaps individual, or it appears individual and may conform, but we are hardly likely to find one that is one and not the other. Note the brilliance of his writing, by the way. This is one of the reasons this is such an influential and important work, is not just the ideas that he's presenting here, it's the prose style is terrific. Note how he regularly is making comparisons and distinctions. So it sets up the binaries, right? Just in terms of your own prose style and thinking. Think of how he introduces an idea and then he flips it around and presents, and then in terms of the inversion of syntax, and he's using all of the literary rhetorical devices that you would find characteristic of good writing historically, and it's condensed. There's not a word that is wasted here. Not a word. And there's a logical progression. You get a sense of a grand march of an argument, and every bit of it along the way you're saying, yes, you got that right. And I see what your point is, and I'm coming with you. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can either take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. The first course is inadmissible. The second is an important exercise of youth. I prefer this or that poet. And the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. I prefer the 17th century. That's the period I like. The poet must be very conscious of the main current. So what's the main current that persists throughout all of the periods? The things that I most gravitate towards, like some people most like John Donne or George Herbert or John Milton or Shakespeare. Or Dante or whoever, that's who they... But the main current is the thing that the poet needs to be aware of, the thing that holds them all together, the common ground, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations, even. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves. How about that? It's an indirect response to the Romantics. But that the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the minds of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. That this development, refinement perhaps, complication certainly, is not, from the point of view of the artist, any improvement. Perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine. Perhaps only in the end based upon a complication in economics and machinery. But the difference between the present and the past is the conscious present is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past's awareness of itself cannot show. So the past is not self-consciously aware of itself, whereas something in the future can be more self-consciously. So then he goes to a quotation. Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Eliot's comment, precisely. And they are that which we know. We know them. Now, I don't know if he's quoting Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher here implicitly, because it's Schleiermacher who says in his romantic hermeneutics that we can know as well, if not better, than those of the past. And the reason why is because of historical distance. So we can know more and better than the Apostle Paul when he's writing about what he writes about. So our knowledge can be superior to his even, according to Schleiermacher. It's a spiritual reading. That's not what Eliot's saying. They are what we know, not something that they didn't know. They were not ignorant. Schleiermacher's perspective suggests an ignorance there in the past that we know better than. And the reason we know better than is because of the distance, the alienation of time. That's not what Eliot is saying here. It's the exact opposite. So he uses the quote and he agrees with it, but pushes it in a different direction. So the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. Yeah, precisely. And they are that which we know. I am alive to a usual objection, to what is clearly part of my program for the métier of poetry. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition. And then he puts in brackets pedantry, which is what the critics would call. He says erudition. They say pedantry. A claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. It will even be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. While, however, we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness, It is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever can be put into a useful shape for examinations, drawing rooms, or the still more pretentious modes of publicity. Some can absorb knowledge, the more tardy must sweat for it. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. What that means is that as he gets older, he gets better. He's not going to be a childhood prodigy and then flame out and will not improve. A good poet will get better as he ages, as Eliot himself did, in my estimation. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something that which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. Now, what does he mean by personality here? Well, there remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Now, this is going back to the beginning of English as literature as a study in the university. It doesn't have any, as I say, disciplinary confines. It doesn't have any legitimacy in the university historically. Unlike philosophy, unlike even the realm of history. It doesn't have any. English literature, that is. Classical literature, yes, of course. Theology, most certainly, that has legitimacy, but literature does not. So what is going to raise literature to the level where people will take it seriously as knowledge of a sort that we not only acknowledge as knowledge, but need to preserve and say this is important for people to study? It is in this depersonalization that art can be said to approach the condition of science. And by science, he just means knowledge. I therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action which takes place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. What a terrible... This is the part I always hate. He uses a metaphor from the science lab to talk about what happens here. Now, he regularly does this in his poetry as well. And C.S. Lewis mocks him for his image of, I think it's of Europe, like a patient etherized on a table. So this is an ugly image. It's not very helpful. It doesn't work. Eliot regularly grasps for modern images to express traditional things. What he's doing is he's working out this seminal essay that he wrote in his poetic practice. And you actually, if you want to appreciate Eliot, you have to read this. Say, oh, this is what you were trying to do. So this is almost a preface to the reading of Eliot's own poetic corpus. I think that beginning actually is the more important, most important of the points that he makes but he's talking about an impersonal theory of poetry. Now, why does he put it this way? Depersonalization, impersonal theory of poetry. It's because of what he is talking about as the personalist heresy. Actually, that's C.S. Lewis's phrase. And they're both identifying it with Romanticism. And it's more or less personal self-expression. But if you want a look at that, look at The Personalist Heresy. It's a book that Lewis wrote in response to another writer. I'm drawing a blank on it now. I read it last summer. Or was the summer before? I'm getting old. But it's this idea of artistry as personal self-expression, of original creativity. He doesn't call it a heresy here. But he is writing against it as being contrary to the tradition. So heresy is probably a unnecessarily inflammatory phrase, although I'm not so sure about that, because the personal heresy leads us to misread Scripture as well, and then it does lead to actual genuine heresy. So how we read texts is, so for me this is interesting in a Christian liberal arts college. Eliot is talking about letters, belles lettres, the literary tradition. He's not referring to Scripture here, right? No reference to it even. He is talking about what we would teach in my department. But it does have an application to reading any text, and it does have an application to how we relate not only to the authors of Scripture, but the church as it received those Scriptures and passed them on. There's a tradition within the church as well in the reception of the text and how it was understood and passed on. And as that doctrine was worked out in a culture, in people's living, and transformed the society, it has a role to play within that, and it has something to do with how to live out the Christian faith. These are all implications of what he's saying in this essay. That's why I think this is such an important essay. Probably ought to be read in theology departments, even though he's not talking about theology. But what they talk about in theology departments now, or in biblical studies departments, is actually not from biblical studies, it's from literary theory, and it's coming into their departments. So I'm going to read this is from another book that he wrote, or an address rather. So the tradition and the individual talent was from 1919, by the way, so the end of the First World War. This, on the other hand, is from a function of criticism, this extract I'm going to read to you, from 1923. I thought of literature then, as I think of it now, of the literature of the world, of the literature of Europe, of the literature of a single country, not as a collection of the writings of individuals, but as, quote, organic wholes, unquote, as systems in relation to which, and only in relation to which, individual works of literary art and the works of individual works of literary art and the works of individual artists have their significance. There is accordingly something outside of the artist to which he owes allegiance, a devotion to which he must surrender and sacrifice himself in order to earn and obtain his unique position. A common inheritance and a common cause unite artists consciously or unconsciously. Now, what he's talking about here is I think he's talking about a common hermeneutic approach. It's a way of reading and interpreting, and it includes not just traditional interpretation. It's relating yourself to the past. How do I as a person relate to the text? There are two words for interpretation, the Latin word interpretatio, and then the new Greek word hermeneutics. They refer to the same thing. Hermes is the messenger of the gods. He speaks on behalf of the gods and he delivers the message. He translates what they have said to people and vice versa. So he's the intermediary. That's hermeneutics. But effectively they're the same things. But hermeneutics is now what is referred to in universities and biblical studies departments and so forth. Hermeneutics involves the idea of a lived experience and the importance of the contemporary and being and living in the world, which interpretation classically seen doesn't. It only looks at the text itself, at the genres, at the schemes and the tropes and the features of it, and all those things we talked about last semester, right? Whereas hermeneutics involves more the human being and the human experience and how we relate to the past. That's what Eliot's doing, though. It's more of a hermeneutic. So this is we want to compare Eliot to what went before, he's talking about how we receive the past and live in the light of it. And it is more in the spirit of hermeneutics than of interpretation. Because he's not talking how we're to read, how he reads Homer. It's more how we should relate to Homer that he's talking about. So it's almost existential. You see? And our contemporary critics as a whole, 20th century onwards, I think they're all interested in the hermeneutic project. They don't actually get into the business of criticism properly. They're more interested in how are we going to live in relation to the past. And almost without exception, their answer is, we don't. We've moved on from that. We don't even need to read it. So we don't need to read even Shakespeare. As a University of California, they banned Shakespeare from the state universities. It's dead white male, oppressive, et cetera, et cetera. So what Eagleton presented as a hypothetical, almost impossible to imagine, and yet, based on his viewpoint, theoretical hypothesis is in fact being worked out less than 40 years after he proposed it. So that's from the function of criticism. 20 years later, here's a new work. Now this is an address to the Virgil Society. Quote, "In our age, when men seem more than ever prone to confuse wisdom with knowledge, and knowledge with information, and try to solve problems of life in terms of engineering, there is coming into existence a new kind of provincialism, not of space, but of time. One for which history is merely the chronicle of human devices, which served their turn and have been scrapped. One for which the world is the property solely of the living, a property in which the dead hold no shares. The menace of this kind of provincialism is that we can all the people on the globe, be provincials together. And those who are not content to be provincials can only become hermits. If this kind of provincialism of time led to greater tolerance in the sense of forbearance, there might be more to be said for it, but it seems more likely to lead to our becoming indifferent in matters where we ought to maintain a distinctive dogma or standard, and to our becoming intolerant in matters which might be left to local or personal preference." The address is called "What is a Classic?" 1944. You would have thought he was talking about our current day. So there's a provincialism in post-nationalism of our contemporaries, of the global government and so forth. It's the alliance of the living against the dead. So we're provincial not in the sense that we don't live in this global village, but provincial in the sense that we are all at odds against those that lived before. So there's an impiety towards the past. And it is one in which we don't even know who we are to some degree, because we're using the language that Shakespeare spoke. And when he was speaking, he was engaging with those who wrote before them. So there's a human provincialism which is having no tolerance for anyone who is no longer alive. And furthermore, it's also directed towards those who are not yet living, which we can see in the abortion movement and so forth. So there's an animus in saying that only those who are living right now are worthy of consideration, and we can ignore the differences that divide those from China and those from Africa and those in North America, and we can ally ourselves and produce a unity and be united against the past. And now the purpose of this is emancipation, but it's emancipation from what Lewis calls the mankind, and it's the abolition of man. So I think they are talking about similar sorts of things. So I submit that to you. I realize that we're out of time, but I think this is a really good defense of traditionalism, and at the same time, it's got the hermeneutic aspect to it, which is not present in the foregoing writers, right? At least I hope you can see what I mean by that. So we're done. Next time we pick up with, as I say, Mr. Eagleton.